and axe murders and wild orgies and all kinds of stuff to marijuana. And in fact, part of the allure of all of that reefer madness propaganda was a way for Puritans, Christians, to go to a movie theater and watch women disrobe high on marijuana, or party or dance, or basically young people partying and having a good time. And they would go tut tut tut, and then they'd go home and masturbate. It was like it was a way for them to, to see porno without having to actually see porno, without, stooping to that level, and they could be high and mighty. And so a lot of those early ones, Marijuana Girl, again, I wish I had the images I could show you, but they're all, lurid sex parties, orgies, it's kind of Girls Gone Wild.
Awesome. Well, this is, in fact, the
1930s,
handout with that,
yeah,
so they all have a copy of that.
Wild orgies, and it's on the handout. Very typical of the time. So I ripped this off from a blog, one of my favorite bloggers, who basically describes Anslinger's shtick. Anslinger was an extremely ambitious man, and he recognized the Bureau of Narcotics as an amazing career opportunity, a new government agency with the opportunity to define both the problem and the solution. He immediately realized that opiates and cocaine wouldn't be enough to help build his agency, so he latched onto marijuana and started to work on making it illegal at the federal level. Anslinger immediately drew upon the themes of racism and violence to draw national attention to the problem he wanted to create. He also promoted and frequently read from gore files, wild reefer madness style exploitation tales of axe murderers on marijuana and sex and Negroes. Here are some quotes that have been widely attributed to Anslinger and his gore files. Quote, "There are 100,000 total marijuana smokers in the U.S., and most are Negroes, Hispanics, Filipinos, and entertainers. Their satanic music, jazz, and swing result from marijuana use." Satanic. "This marijuana causes white women to seek sexual relations with Negroes." This is an ongoing theme in the original Reefer Madness. Hysteria was the concern about white women sleeping with people of color, entertainers and any others. The primary reason to outlaw marijuana is its effect on the degenerate races. Marijuana is an addictive drug which produces in its users insanity, criminality, and death. Reefer makes darkies think they're as good as white men. That's how enlightenment is.
That's so horrible.
Marijuana leads to pacifism and communist brainwashing. And you get these conflicting things where marijuana makes you a couch potato on the one hand, and it makes you an axe murderer on the other. You smoke a joint.
Wait for someone to approach your couch and then
That's okay. Marijuana is the most violence-causing drug in the history of mankind. Overlooking alcohol. And he loved to pull out his old version of the assassin definition. In the year 1090, there was founded in Persia the religious and military order of the Assassins, whose history is one of cruelty, barbarity, and murder. And for good reason. The members were confirmed users of hashish, or marijuana. And it is from the Arabs hashashin that we have the English word assassin. So, on our side of it, it was actually worse. What we had was Emily Murphy, and she actually began before Anslinger. She made her heyday in 1922 by publishing a series of articles in Maclean's magazine. And in some parts, she was probably responsible for cannabis prohibition in Canada. There was a famous case about 10 years ago that actually found its way to the Supreme Court of Canada called R.B. Clay. Chris Clay was a hemp shop owner in London, Ontario, and he was busted selling clones. He was pushing his luck. He wanted to challenge the law and got caught selling clones. And the resultant trial was like 2 or 3 years long, and it produced a warehouse full of documentation and expert witnesses, and they laid it all down, the whole history of drug prohibition, and the Justice John McCart gave a nice summary. He said, "The first narcotic prohibition legislation was the 1911 Opium and Drug Act, which contained no reference to marijuana. It was not until 1923 that marijuana was added to the schedule of prohibited drugs. Curiously, there was no discussion or debate in the House of Commons about its inclusion, other than the bald statement, 'There was a new drug in the schedule.'" So when somebody says to you, drugs aren't dangerous because they're illegal because they're dangerous, you probably heard this mantra, that's not true. They didn't discuss the dangers of cannabis at all. It was just, there's a new drug in the schedule.
How did they have like the authority to just pump that in there?
It's weird because, in the States, to prohibit alcohol, they had to change the Constitution. It was outside federal jurisdiction, right? So they actually had to change the Constitution to give them the jurisdiction to do it. When it came to cannabis, they used what's called the Intercommerce Clause, which says the federal government can lord over anything that involves commerce between the states. And it was really a stretch. Quite recently, a gal by the name of Angel Reich down in California, who was a medical marijuana patient growing her own in her backyard, took the government to court and said, what the hell does this have to do with interstate commerce? And the court ruled that because she had taken herself off the black market, she was affecting interstate commerce. In Canada, it's a somewhat different story. The government can basically prohibit anything at once. And the upshot of the Clay trial was that the court agreed that marijuana is relatively harmless, but said that there are some people who are vulnerable to it, namely pregnant women, adolescents, and people predisposed to psychosis. And in an effort to protect them, the government was justified in criminalizing everybody.
Oy.
Yeah, because if you think about it, what thing that is fun, recreation, could one engage into to excess anybody and not have some harm come to them? But by that definition, eating Twinkies, watching TV,
football,
video games, sports, bungee jumping, you name it, could theoretically be prohibited. And unfortunately, the Supreme Court of Canada basically gave the government carte blanche. They did say the law is stupid, but they said the government has a right to be stupid.
We're doing pretty good at it.
Anyway, there was no correspondence in the Drug Control Division files about the addition of the new drug. One might ask why it was included, because until '37 there were no convictions for possession of marijuana, and for the ensuing 20 years the annual conviction rate fluctuated between 0 and 12.
People?
Yes, across Canada.
Wow.
So there was no pot in Canada. So why although there was no evidence of a problem of marijuana use in Canada in 1923, its inclusion in the Opiate Drug Act may have been influenced by the writings of Emily Murphy, a crusading Edmonton, Alberta magistrate. In 1920, she published a series of sensational and racist articles in Maclean's magazine on the horrible effects of the drug use and the deliberate debauching of the young by evil, often alien traffickers. The articles were later expanded into a book, The Black Candle, published in 1922. Her views on marijuana were derived mainly from correspondence with U.S. enforcement officials. By this time, a number of states had started to prohibit it, but they hadn't prohibited it federally yet. She quotes, for example, the chief of the LA Police Department, quote, "Persons using this narcotic smoke the dried leaves of the plant, which has the effect of driving them completely insane. The addict loses all sense of moral responsibility. Addicts to this drug, while under its influence, are immune to pain." I always found that interesting, because at the same time they're saying it has no medical benefits, and yet it's apparently a really effective painkiller, and could be injured without having any realization of their condition. While in this condition, they become raving maniacs and are liable to kill or indulge in any form of violence to any other persons using the most savage methods of cruelty without, as said before, any sense of moral responsibility. So don't turn your back on Ted. If this drug is indulged to any great extent, it ends in the untimely death of its addict. There's absolutely no truth to any of these wild and outlandish claims. It was in this climate of irrational fear and the criminal sanctions against marijuana were enacted. So it was a great cannabis panic that caused cannabis to be prohibited in 1923 in Canada, and that was largely caused by the media. So while there are vested interests and other motivations for prohibition, fear of black men and so forth, the media really caused the initial scare. Here's an example of one from 1934 from the New York Times. Poisonous weed is being sold quite freely in pool halls and beer gardens. Children are said to buy it. Denver. Although as appalling as its effects on the human mind and body as narcotics, the consumption of marijuana appears to be proceeding virtually unchecked in Colorado. Well, and I should mention, this article was before cannabis was prohibited, so it was the equivalent. It was the news begging the government to do something about the marijuana menace. The drug is particularly popular with Latin Americans, and its use is rapidly spreading to include all classes. The poisonous weed, which maddens the senses and emaciates the body of the user, is being sold more or less openly in pool halls and beer gardens throughout the West and Southwest, and according to some authorities, is being peddled to school children. The federal government is powerless to